You are not making any sense at all. What rubbish are you presenting?
For 6 years, Deborah Halloway walked through the doors of Coleman Financial Group like she owned every square foot of it. She had a corner office, a direct line to the CEO, and a reputation that made grown men and women flinch when her heels hit the tile. Nobody questioned her. Nobody dared. She had built herself into something the entire company feared, and fear, she believed, was the only currency that mattered. What she never once considered was that fear has a shelf life, and hers was about to expire in front of everyone she had ever humiliated. On the morning everything changed, Deborah walked into the building the same way she always did, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, barely glancing at the people who stepped aside to let her pass. She did not know that in less than 8 hours, security would be waiting by the elevator with a box for her belongings. She did not know that the woman she had spent 2 years trying to destroy had been quietly documenting every single thing she had done. And she certainly did not know that this ordinary Tuesday would become the day her entire career unraveled in front of the people she once controlled. This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, a young analyst who showed up every day determined to do good work, and the manager who decided, for reasons no one could ever fully explain, that Sarah would be the target of her cruelty. It is a story about power, about silence, and about what happens when the people we underestimate finally decide they have had enough. Before we go any further into how this story unfolds, we want to know something from you. Where are you watching this from tonight? Let us know in the comments. We would love to hear from you. And if you have not already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. By the time this story reaches its end, you will understand exactly how a woman who seemed completely untouchable, a woman who answered to no one and feared nothing, found herself standing in an empty parking garage with everything she had built collapsing around her. You will meet the people who tried to warn others and were ignored. You will hear about the meeting that changed everything, the folder that nobody was supposed to find, and the moment Deborah Halloway realized that the very people she had dismissed as powerless were the ones holding her fate in their hands. Stay with us, because what happened inside that office building will stay with you long after this video ends. To understand how Deborah Halloway became the most feared woman at Coleman Financial Group, you have to go back 9 years, long before Sarah Mitchell ever walked through those doors. Deborah started as a junior account manager, ambitious, sharp, and hungry for a seat at the table. She worked long hours, she said the right things to the right people, and slowly she climbed. Co-workers who knew her back then described someone who could be charming when it benefited her and cold the moment it did not. She learned quickly that the executives above her cared more about numbers than about how those numbers were achieved, and she used that lesson to her advantage every single year after that. The CEO, Richard Coleman, had built the company from nothing over 3 decades, and by the time Deborah joined, he had already stepped back from the daily details of managing people. He trusted his senior staff to run their departments, and he rarely questioned the methods behind strong quarterly numbers. Deborah understood this better than anyone else in the building. She realized early on that if she kept her numbers impressive enough, nobody upstairs would ever look too closely at how her team felt about working for her. It was a strategy that would carry her for nearly a decade, and it worked because almost nobody was willing to test it. By the time she was promoted to senior operations manager, Deborah had already developed a pattern that would define the rest of her career. She surrounded herself with people who agreed with her and pushed out anyone who challenged her, often before they even realized what was happening. Former employees would later describe subtle exclusions, missed promotions that never made sense, and a growing sense that questioning Deborah was simply not worth the risk to your career. The executives above her saw a manager who delivered results. The employees below her saw something else entirely, but very few of them ever said a word. One of the earliest people to experience this firsthand was a man named Robert Yates, who worked under Deborah during her first year as a manager. Robert had been with the company longer than she had, and in the beginning, colleagues expected him to be the one training her, not the other way around. Within 4 months, Robert found himself removed from every meaningful project he had built over the previous 3 years. He was never given a clear reason. He was simply told the department was moving in a different direction, and 6 weeks later, he resigned. Robert would later tell a former coworker that he had never felt so quietly erased from a place he had once loved working. There was also a woman named Patricia Wynn, who joined the team 2 years after Robert left. Patricia was known for asking thoughtful questions in meetings, the kind of questions that occasionally made Deborah's numbers look less impressive than they appeared on paper. It did not take long before Patricia noticed she was being left off emails she should have been included on, and assigned tasks far beneath her actual role. When she finally raised the issue with Deborah directly, she was told, calmly and without hesitation, that perhaps this position simply was not the right fit for her going forward. Patricia left the company 3 months later, and like Robert before her, she never spoke publicly about why. By the time these stories reached other employees, most of them arrived as second-hand rumors, softened and vague, the kind of office folklore that gets repeated in break rooms but never taken seriously enough to act on. New hires were told, almost as a joke, to stay on Deborah's good side. Few people understood just how literal that warning actually was. Deborah had learned to operate in a way that left almost no fingerprints, timing her decisions carefully, phrasing her criticisms just vaguely enough to avoid ever sounding cruel on paper. To executives above her, she looked like a demanding but fair leader. To the people beneath her, she looked like something entirely different. Sarah Mitchell joined Coleman Financial Group 3 years later, straight out of graduate school, eager and a little nervous on her first day. She had worked hard for this opportunity, and she believed, like most new employees do, that if she simply did good work, she would be treated fairly. For the first several months, that seemed true. Sarah was reliable, well-liked by her peers, and slowly earning the kind of quiet respect that comes from consistency rather than flattery. She had no idea that her steady rise was about to catch the attention of a woman who did not tolerate anyone shining too brightly next to her. During her first few months, Sarah worked closely with a coworker named James Carter, a mid-level analyst who had been at the company for almost 5 years. James had watched the Robert Yates situation unfold from a distance, and he had watched Patricia Nguyen leave the same way. He liked Sarah immediately, recognizing in her the same quiet diligence he had seen in the others before their departures. He did not say anything to her at first. He had learned, painfully, that raising concerns about Deborah rarely ended well for the person raising them. Instead, he simply kept a careful distance, watching, the way people do when they suspect a storm is coming but cannot yet prove it. The first signs were small enough to dismiss. A comment in a meeting that felt slightly too sharp, credit for a project that somehow ended up on someone else's slide, a calendar invite that never made it to Sarah's inbox. Coworkers who had been at the company longer recognized the pattern immediately, though none of them said anything out loud. They had seen this before with other employees who eventually transferred, resigned, or simply disappeared from the org chart without explanation. Sarah, still new and still hopeful, told herself it was nothing. She had no way of knowing that Deborah Halloway had already decided she did not belong. Over the following months, the small moments began to add up in a way that was harder to ignore. Sarah noticed that her ideas, when she brought them up in one-on-one meetings with Deborah, would somehow reappear weeks later in larger meetings, presented by Deborah herself, as though she had thought of them independently. At first, Sarah assumed it was simply a coincidence, the kind of overlap that happens naturally when two people work closely together. She told herself this more than once, because the alternative explanation felt too uncomfortable to sit with. It is a strange kind of loneliness, doubting your own memory in order to keep believing the best about someone with power over your career. Around this time, Sarah began confiding in a close friend outside of work, a woman named Angela Ford, who had gone through something eerily similar at a different company years earlier. Angela listened carefully to every detail Sarah described, and she recognized the pattern immediately, having lived through a version of it herself. She gently encouraged Sarah to start writing things down, not out of paranoia, but simply so that she would have an accurate record if she ever needed one. Sarah brushed off the suggestion at first. She still wanted to believe that hard work alone would be enough to protect her, and that whatever tension existed with Deborah was simply a personality clash that would eventually smooth itself out on its own. The turning point came during a quarterly review meeting that Sarah had spent weeks preparing for. She had built a proposal that could have saved the department real money, and she had every reason to feel proud walking into that room. She had rehearsed her presentation twice the night before, anticipating questions from the executive team, and preparing thoughtful answers for each one. Walking into the conference room that morning, she felt something she had not felt in months, a genuine sense of confidence in her own work. That confidence would not survive the next 20 minutes. Instead, Deborah interrupted her twice within the first 5 minutes, dismissed her numbers in front of the entire team, and redirected the conversation toward a broader strategy she claimed to have been developing for weeks. Sarah sat there, stunned, trying to find an opening to continue, but every attempt was met with another interruption. By the end of the meeting, the proposal Sarah had built almost entirely on her own had quietly transformed, in the language used around the room, into something Deborah had guided her team toward all along. Nobody in that room seemed to notice the shift happening in real time. Nobody, except James Carter, who sat quietly near the back, watching it unfold exactly the way it had unfolded for Robert and Patricia years earlier. 2 weeks later, in a separate meeting with senior leadership, Deborah presented a nearly identical version of Sarah's original proposal, this time framed entirely as her own strategic initiative. Executives praised her thinking. Richard Coleman himself sent a brief note afterward, commending her vision for the department. Sarah found out about the meeting secondhand, through a colleague who had been in the room and assumed she already knew. She sat at her desk that afternoon, replaying the quarterly review in her mind, finally understanding that what had happened to her was not a misunderstanding or a coincidence. It was something that had been done to her deliberately, and she had let herself believe otherwise for far too long. Word spread quickly through the office, the way it always does, in hallway whispers and quiet messages sent after hours. James Carter, who had watched Deborah operate this way for years, finally pulled Sarah aside one evening after most of the office had gone home. He told her something he had never told anyone else directly. She was not the first person this had happened to, and if history repeated itself, Deborah would find a way to push her out entirely within the next few months. James described what had happened to Robert Yates, and what had happened to Patricia Nguyen, filling in details Sarah had only ever heard as vague rumors. Each of them had been convinced, at least for a while, that it was somehow their own fault. That night, Sarah went home and made a decision that would change everything. She was not going to disappear quietly. Over the following weeks, Sarah began keeping careful records, saving emails, noting timestamps, and writing down details immediately after meetings, while they were still fresh in her mind. She was not looking for revenge in those early days. She simply wanted the truth to exist somewhere outside of her own memory, in case she ever needed to prove what she already knew had happened. Around the same time, Deborah's behavior escalated in ways that felt less careful than before, almost as if she sensed something shifting beneath her, even if she could not name exactly what it was. Meetings were scheduled specifically at times Sarah could not attend, assignments were quietly reassigned to other team members, and a formal write-up appeared in Sarah's personnel file, citing vague performance concerns that had never once been raised with her directly in any prior conversation. It became clear to Sarah, and increasingly to James as well, that Deborah was building a formal case to have her removed from the company entirely. She was not being subtle about it anymore, and that lack of subtlety would ultimately become one of the biggest mistakes of her career. What Deborah did not know was that Sarah had already scheduled a confidential meeting with the Human Resources Department, bringing with her weeks of documentation, timestamps, and a written account of the quarterly review meeting that had started it all. Sarah walked into that meeting nervous but resolved, aware that she was taking a risk that could easily end her career at the company instead of Deborah's. In the days leading up to that meeting, Sarah barely slept. She rehearsed what she would say the same way she had once rehearsed her ill-fated proposal, except this time, she was not trying to impress anyone. She was simply trying to tell the truth clearly enough that no one could dismiss it as exaggeration or misunderstanding. She printed physical copies of every email she had saved, organized by date, and highlighted the specific moments where her work had quietly become someone else's. James offered to sit with her the morning of the meeting, though ultimately she decided to walk in alone, feeling that her account needed to stand on its own without appearing coordinated with anyone else at the company. The HR representative who took her initial complaint, a woman named Diane Osei, had been with the company for over a decade and had a reputation for taking employee concerns seriously, though even she admitted afterward that she did not fully grasp the scale of what she was hearing during that first conversation. Diane listened for nearly 90 minutes without interruption, occasionally asking Sarah to clarify a date or confirm a detail, writing everything down by hand rather than typing. A habit, she said, helped her absorb information more carefully during sensitive conversations. By the end of the meeting, Diane told Sarah only that the matter would be reviewed appropriately, offering no promises about timeline or outcome, a response that left Sarah feeling both relieved and uncertain all at once. The investigation moved slower than Sarah expected, the kind of slow that makes you question whether anyone actually believes you. HR interviewed her over the course of 2 separate meetings, took detailed notes, and promised confidentiality throughout the process, but weeks passed without any visible sign that anything was actually changing. During this period, Sarah continued working under Deborah every single day, forcing herself to remain professional in every meeting while privately wondering whether she had made a mistake coming forward at all. She confided in Angela Ford almost nightly during this stretch, and it was Angela who reminded her, again and again, that silence had never once protected anyone in a situation like this. Meanwhile, rumors of an internal investigation began circulating quietly through the office, though no one outside a small circle knew exactly what it involved. Some employees speculated it had to do with budget irregularities in another department entirely, a theory that spread for almost 2 weeks before quietly fading once nothing more came of it. Others assumed a completely different manager was under scrutiny, a man in the marketing division who had recently clashed publicly with a client. For a brief period, Deborah herself seemed entirely unaware that she was the actual subject of the inquiry, continuing to behave exactly as she always had, confident that whatever was happening in the background had nothing to do with her. Then, something unexpected happened. James Carter, the same coworker who had first warned Sarah, quietly came forward with his own account of what he had witnessed over the years, including detailed memories of what had happened to Robert Yates and Patricia Wynn long before Sarah had ever joined the company. HR reached out to Robert directly, tracking him down through old employment records, and to everyone's surprise, he agreed to speak, explaining that he had always assumed nothing would ever come of raising the issue, and that he had simply moved on with his life instead. Patricia was more hesitant when contacted, but after speaking privately with Sarah over the phone one evening, she agreed to share her account as well, describing almost the exact same pattern of exclusion and quiet dismissal that Sarah herself had experienced. What started as one woman's complaint slowly became a pattern too large for HR to ignore, a pattern stretching back nearly 6 years, further than anyone in leadership had ever been willing to acknowledge existed. Each new account added another layer of detail, another date, another specific incident that lined up almost perfectly with the others. Investigators began cross-referencing personnel files, promotion records, and internal emails going back years, building a timeline that painted a picture Deborah had spent nearly a decade making sure no one would ever see clearly in one place. For a short period, the investigation actually moved in the wrong direction entirely. One junior HR coordinator, reviewing early complaints without full context, became convinced that the real issue was not Deborah at all, but a scheduling conflict between two departments that had nothing to do with her behavior. 2 full days were spent chasing that theory before a senior investigator, reviewing the same documents with fresh eyes, recognized that the coordinator had misread the timeline entirely. It was a small delay in the larger picture, but at the time, it left Sarah anxious for an entire weekend, wondering if her complaint was being quietly buried under an unrelated explanation. Around the same time, a rumor began circulating that the entire investigation was actually about expense report irregularities in Deborah's department. A theory that gained enough traction that even Deborah herself reportedly mentioned it to a colleague in passing, seemingly unconcerned. She spent part of that week reorganizing old expense documentation, according to someone who worked near her office, apparently convinced that whatever scrutiny was coming had nothing to do with how she treated the people who worked for her. It would later strike several employees as almost unbelievable that a woman so calculated in every other part of her career had failed to consider that her treatment of employees might be the actual problem. Sarah, meanwhile, continued showing up to work every day during this stretch, sitting through meetings led by the very person under investigation, forcing herself to remain composed while privately counting the days since she had filed her complaint. She later described this period as the hardest part of the entire experience, harder even than the original humiliation in the quarterly review. Waiting, she said, gives your mind room to doubt everything, to wonder if you exaggerated what happened, to wonder if anyone will ever actually believe you. Angela Ford continued checking in most evenings, reminding Sarah that the silence from HR did not mean nothing was happening, only that these processes rarely move as quickly as the people living through them need them to. It was James Carter's decision to come forward that changed the pace of everything. Until that point, HR had one formal complaint, detailed but singular, easy enough for a skeptical executive to dismiss as a personality conflict between two strong-willed employees. Once James added his account, along with the names of Robert Yates and Patricia Wynn, the investigation shifted from reviewing one complaint to reconstructing a pattern spanning years. Investigators requested archived personnel files that had not been pulled in years, cross-checking exit interview notes that, in hindsight, contained small warning signs no one had ever connected to one another. As the investigation widened, HR uncovered something Deborah had clearly never expected anyone to find: performance reviews that had been quietly altered after the fact, softening praise for employees she wanted to push out, and inflating minor issues into documented concerns. Emails where she instructed subordinates to carefully document minor mistakes made by certain employees, while explicitly telling them to overlook far more serious issues from employees she favored. A trail built patiently over years, showing exactly how she had engineered the departures of at least 4 employees before Sarah, each one made to feel as though the fault rested entirely with them. What had once looked like isolated complaints now looked like a deliberate, repeated strategy, carried out by someone who genuinely believed she would never be questioned. Richard Coleman was informed of the investigation's findings personally, and colleagues who saw him that day described him as visibly shaken, having trusted Deborah's judgment for the better part of a decade without ever once looking closely beneath her results. He reviewed the documentation himself over an entire weekend, according to two senior staff members who spoke with him directly afterward, reportedly reading through years of altered performance reviews late into Saturday night, unable to reconcile the woman described in those documents with the manager he believed he had promoted on merit alone. By Monday morning, the decision had already been made, though almost no one in the building yet knew what was coming. That Monday, Deborah arrived at the office with no indication that anything unusual awaited her, according to the front desk employee who greeted her that morning exactly as she always did. She had a client call scheduled for later that afternoon and had spent part of her weekend preparing notes for it, notes that would ultimately never be used. Around 11 in the morning, she received a calendar invite for an unscheduled meeting in the main conference room, listed only as an internal review, a phrase vague enough that she reportedly assumed it concerned a budget matter rather than anything involving her directly. The meeting where it all came to a head took place in the same conference room where Deborah had dismissed Sarah's proposal months earlier. This time, Deborah was the one sitting across from HR and two senior executives, watching as they laid out everything they had found: witnesses, documents, a pattern impossible to explain away. According to someone who witnessed part of the exchange from outside the glass walls of the conference room, Deborah initially tried to explain each piece of evidence individually, offering an explanation for the altered reviews, a justification for the missed promotions, a reason for every single decision laid in front of her. For the first several minutes, Deborah reportedly remained composed, treating the meeting the way she had treated every difficult conversation throughout her career, as a problem to be managed rather than a reckoning to be faced. She pointed to strong quarterly numbers, reminded the room of her tenure, and suggested that any complaints likely stemmed from employees who simply could not handle a demanding work environment. It was a version of the same argument she had used successfully for 9 years, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though she genuinely believed it would work one more time. But as the meeting continued and the timeline grew longer, her explanations grew thinner, and eventually, she stopped offering them altogether. When investigators presented the altered performance review for Patricia Noen, alongside the original unedited version recovered from an old server backup nobody had realized still existed, Deborah reportedly went silent for nearly a full minute, according to someone present in the room. It was, by every account given afterward, the longest anyone at Coleman Financial Group had ever seen her go without a response ready. Those who worked near that conference room that day said the silence afterward was unlike anything they had heard in that building before. Deborah left without her badge, without her office keys, and without the confidence that had carried her through 9 years of controlling everyone around her. She walked past the same desks she had walked past thousands of times before, except this time, no one stepped aside out of fear. A few employees later admitted they had simply watched her go, unsure of what to feel after years of silence finally giving way to something else entirely. The woman who once decided who stayed and who left had just experienced exactly that, from the other side. What happened to Deborah Halloway after that day surprised even the people who had wanted to see her held accountable. She was not simply fired and forgotten. Word of the investigation eventually reached other companies in the same industry, the kind of word that travels quietly through professional circles and follows a person from one interview to the next. She applied for several director-level positions over the following year, according to a former colleague who stayed loosely in touch with her, and each time, the process seemed to stall shortly after reference checks were completed. She struggled to find a role at the same level she once held, eventually accepting a smaller position at a company 2 states away, far from the industry circles where her name still carried weight. A former colleague who ran into Deborah, nearly a year later, at an industry conference, described the encounter as almost unrecognizable compared to the woman everyone at Coleman Financial Group had once feared. She was polite, quiet, and noticeably careful with her words, a version of herself that seemed to measure every sentence before speaking it. When the conversation briefly touched on Coleman Financial Group, Deborah reportedly changed the subject quickly, offering no explanation and asking none of the questions she once would have demanded answers to. It was, this colleague said, the first time she had ever seen Deborah look uncertain of herself in any setting. Robert Yates, reached briefly for his reaction after the investigation concluded, said only that he wished someone had listened years earlier, though he admitted he understood why it had taken this long. He had moved into a different industry entirely by that point, and while he described feeling a quiet sense of validation, he also admitted that the years he had spent doubting his own abilities after leaving Coleman Financial Group were not something a single investigation could fully undo. Patricia Wynn, now working at a different financial firm entirely, described a quiet sense of relief upon learning what had happened, telling Sarah privately that she had spent years wondering if she had imagined the whole thing. James Carter remained at Coleman Financial Group, eventually earning a promotion of his own, one built entirely on his actual work rather than on staying quiet. Colleagues noted a subtle shift in him after the investigation concluded, a willingness to speak up in meetings that had not been there before, as though watching the outcome of Sarah's decision had given him permission to trust his own judgment a little more openly than he had in years. Sarah Mitchell was offered a promotion into a leadership role shortly after the investigation concluded, the very kind of position Deborah had once made absolutely certain she would never reach. She accepted it cautiously, aware of how much the culture around her would need to change before that promotion could mean what it should. In her first few months in the role, she made a quiet habit of pulling aside newer employees after meetings, asking simple questions about how they were being treated, questions that no one had ever thought to ask her when she needed them most. Colleagues who worked with her afterward described a manager who made a deliberate point of listening carefully in meetings, crediting ideas to the people who actually had them, and checking in privately with newer employees who seemed hesitant to speak up. It was, several coworkers noted, almost the exact opposite of everything Deborah had once represented. Richard Coleman, for his part, reportedly implemented new procedures across the company in the months following the investigation, including anonymous reporting channels and mandatory reviews of any personnel decision involving repeated turnover on a single team. Whether those changes came from genuine reflection or simply a desire to avoid another situation like Deborah's, is something only Richard himself could truly answer, though employees who remained at the company noted that the atmosphere shifted noticeably in the year that followed, becoming, in the words of one longtime staff member, the first time in nearly a decade that people felt safe enough to speak honestly in a room with their manager. Looking back, this was never really a story about one manager and one employee. It was about how easily harm continues when the people around it choose silence, and how long it can take for the truth to catch up with someone who believes they are untouchable. Sarah did not set out to destroy anyone. She simply refused to disappear quietly, the way Robert and Patricia once had. And in doing so, she gave every other employee who had suffered in silence a reason to finally speak. Deborah Halloway spent 9 years building a reputation on fear, and it took less than 9 months for the truth to take all of it away. Perhaps the hardest part of this story to sit with is not what Deborah did, but how long it took for anyone to stop her. 9 years is a long time for a pattern to repeat itself in plain view, protected not by anything particularly clever, but simply by people's willingness to look away, to assume someone else would eventually say something, to convince themselves it was not their place to get involved. Robert stayed quiet. Patricia stayed quiet. Even James, for years, chose distance over confrontation, not out of indifference, but out of a very human fear of becoming the next person removed from the org chart without explanation. It was only when Sarah refused to accept that same silence that the pattern finally broke. So now we want to hear from you. Have you ever worked with someone like Deborah? Someone who seemed completely untouchable until the truth finally caught up with them? Tell us what happened in the comments below. We read every single one. Make sure you are subscribed so you never miss our videos.